It was a Sunday like any other, or so I thought. The house smelled of lamb stew simmering with rosemary and cumin, just the way Samuel used to like it. Honey cornbread baked to a golden crisp was cooling on the windowsill. I had set the dining table with the porcelain dishes we had received on our 25th anniversary, polished the silverware, arranged fresh roses from my garden into a tight bouquet, and even ironed the table runner. Everything gleamed. Everything felt alive. That house on Hickory Lane had been my home for more than 3 decades. Every corner held a memory. Every crack in the wall had a story, and I loved it with all my heart. So when Malcolm arrived with Sierra and the twins, I thought it would be just another dinner filled with updates from school, polite laughter, and Malcolm reminded me to drink more water. But the moment he stepped in, I noticed something had changed. His eyes didn't soften at the sight of the home where he grew up. Instead, they scanned the room like a building inspector searching for fault lines. Sierra followed suit, her smile polite but tight, and Jordan and Caleb gave me quick hugs before disappearing to the family room as usual. Dinner went on with the usual small talk. I asked the twins about college applications, Sierra about her new yoga class, and Malcolm about his recent work projects. But even as we spoke, I could feel something brewing beneath the surface. Malcolm barely touched his food. Sierra kept glancing at him, clearly waiting for some cue. When the plates had been cleared and the lemon tea was served, Malcolm leaned back in Samuel's old leather recliner, his chosen seat every time he visited, and said, "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation." I blinked. My living situation? I looked around at the gleaming floors, the freshly painted walls, the roses still standing proudly in their vase. "What about it?" I asked calmly. Sierra jumped in, her voice soft but patronizing. "Eve, it's just not safe anymore. This house is so big and all these stairs. What if something happens and you can't reach anyone in time?" I could feel my spine straighten, a quiet fire lighting behind my ribs, but I stayed composed. "And what part of this house have I failed to maintain?" I asked. Malcolm exchanged a glance with Sierra, then reached beneath the recliner and pulled out a thick folder neatly tabbed, color-coded. He opened it like a lawyer presenting closing arguments. "We've been doing some research," he began. "Jordan and Caleb will be off to college soon, and Sierra and I have been thinking the attic could be converted into a really cozy space for you, about 650 square feet. We'd build a kitchenette, install a small bathroom, even a little sit-in area. You'd have privacy, but still be close to family. Isn't that ideal?" He smiled, as if offering me a beachfront condo instead of an attic above their heads. Sierra added quickly, "You'd get to see the grandkids all the time. It's a win-win, really." And that's when it hit me they weren't asking. They were presenting. This was a pre-packaged plan, complete with costs, blueprints, and timelines, all prepared in advance, all without ever speaking to me first. They spoke of it like a gift, a solution. But what it really was containment. A decision rooted not in love, but in assumption. That I was old, that I was fragile, that I was incapable of managing my own life. "You could still visit with the rest of the family whenever you'd like," Sierra chirped, "and we'd always be close if you needed help." Visit. In a house I helped them buy. A house I put $80,000 into years ago from my first real estate flip. A house they'd still be roaming freely while I would be reduced to the attic like a dusty relic. I looked at Malcolm carefully. He had my husband's jawline, but none of his depth. "What are you planning to do with this house?" I asked. He smiled again. "We spoke to a realtor. She thinks we could get maybe 900,000 for it, $1 million if we get lucky." I almost laughed. The house had been appraised just last month at $2.2 million, but they hadn't bothered to check. Because they thought I didn't know. Because they thought I couldn't possibly manage that kind of information anymore. Their plan was clear. Sell my house, pocket the profits, and reward me with an attic apartment built from the leftovers. Malcolm leaned forward, placing a hand on mine. "This is about what's best for everyone, Mom. You'd be safe, we'd have peace of mind, and you'd have everything you need." He said it with the confidence of a man who thought he was being noble. But I didn't flinch. I smiled gently and said, "Let me think about it." And I meant it. Not because I needed time, but because I needed peace. That night, I sat in the master bedroom Samuel and I had shared for over 34 years. I stared at the ceiling, ran my fingers along the embroidered edge of the duvet, and whispered to the silence, "They have no idea who I am." You see, while Malcolm was busy drawing diagrams and consulting contractors, I had been quietly building an empire. I didn't need their permission. I didn't need their plans. What I needed was time, and that time had finally arrived. The next morning, while the birds outside chirped their usual sunrise songs, I called Renee Carter, top-tier real estate broker, the same woman I had been working with secretly for months. "Renee," I said, "let's list the house, full value, fast close." Her voice lit up. "Eve, you're going to love this. This is going to be fun." And oh, it was. She sent over her staging team, professional photographers, twilight shots, listings that made Architectural Digest look plain. Within 72 hours, the house was live, the offers rolling in, and I didn't have to lift a finger. Not one. And while Malcolm thought I was slowly giving in to age and fear, I was already picking out finishes for my new home in Annapolis, a 3,800 square foot waterfront estate with a private dock, 2 guest houses, and the kind of kitchen that made you want to cook barefoot while jazz played in the background. I paid for it in full, no mortgage, no cosigner. Just the profits from my portfolio, a little magic from Tobias Freeman, my financial advisor of 8 years, and the determination of a woman who had spent her entire life being underestimated. But the real joy, the moment I'll never forget, was standing at the edge of my front lawn, watching the for sale sign being hammered into the ground, just 2 days after Malcolm handed me that folder. I stood there, in the crisp September morning, in the very same spot where I once taught him how to ride a bike, watching the real estate agent finalize the listing. The house gleamed behind me like a cathedral of memories, and for the first time in 2 years since Samuel passed away, I felt a deep, glowing satisfaction rise in my chest. They thought I was losing my grip. What they didn't know was that I was letting go on purpose, with grace, and on my own terms. While Malcolm was busy scheduling attic renovations and strategizing how to manage my so-called golden years, I was finalizing the sale of a home I built from nothing and quietly laying the foundation for my next chapter. The bids came fast. A surgeon from Boston, a tech entrepreneur from D.C., and a hedge fund partner all wanted the house. A bidding war broke out. The final price? $2.5 million. Cash. 15-day close. I signed the final papers with a Mont Blanc pen Samuel gave me on our 20th anniversary. There was something poetic about that. The house that once held all of our memories now funding a future that belonged solely to me. But I wasn't done yet. After finalizing the sale, I made my second call, this time to Tobias Freeman, my longtime financial advisor and the only man besides Samuel I had trusted with my future. "It's time," I told him. "Move forward with the Annapolis purchase and start updating the estate documents. Some beneficiaries need a revision." There was a pause on the line, then a smile in Tobias's voice. "Yes, ma'am. I already started drafting them. And, just so you know, your year-to-date investment returns are outpacing the S&P by 14%. I didn't say much. I just closed my eyes and let that sink in. It wasn't about the numbers. It was about the validation. That every night I spent reading real estate forecasts and stock reports instead of watching TV had been worth it. That every property I purchased, every contractor I managed, every renovation I oversaw, all of it had meaning. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving, quietly, powerfully. But to understand how I got here, we need to rewind. It started 3 years ago when Samuel passed. I was 70, alone, grieving, and suddenly aware of how invisible the world expected me to become. People called to offer condolences, casseroles, and casual suggestions to consider assisted communities. Friends hinted that maybe I should travel, downsize, or start knitting. Everyone spoke to me slower, softer, with that tone, that careful, condescending tone reserved for the elderly and the broken. But I didn't feel broken. I felt awakened. Like a storm had passed and left me with nothing but a wide-open sky. I took the insurance money and the savings we had built together, and I began learning, reading, attending seminars, watching hours of webinars on real estate investing, market trends, portfolio diversification. I took meetings with young professionals half my age and learned to speak in numbers instead of emotion. I registered Langston Property & Co., a business that would become my anchor, my outlet, and eventually my weapon. My first investment was a triplex in East Orange. I bought it for $470,000, poured in another $60,000 in upgrades, modern kitchens, new hardwood floors, HVAC, and rented it within 3 months. Net monthly income? $6,100. The building is now worth over $800,000. Next came a duplex in Newark, scooped from an estate sale. I paid $840,000, invested another $150,000, and leased both units for $8,000 per month total. Then I acquired a 4-unit property in Trenton, undervalued and undermaintained. I bought it for $1.1 million, put in $200,000, brought in a professional management team, and turned it into a fully leased gem that brings in over $10,000 a month and is now appraised at $1.7 million. As of the morning Malcolm brought me that attic proposal, my real estate portfolio was worth over $9 million with a cash reserve of $1.4 million and a passive monthly income exceeding $24,000. And not a single soul in my family knew. They didn't know because they never asked. They never wondered how I paid my bills, who managed the property taxes, or how I handled maintenance. They assumed I was drifting, deteriorating, delicate, and because I didn't correct them, their confidence grew. They began planting seeds, whispering to neighbors, telling my best friend Michelle that I was forgetful, calling my cousins in Georgia to say I was acting off. Malcolm even brought a therapist to dinner, once a young woman named Dr. Janelle, claiming she just wanted to get to know the family dynamic. 5 minutes into the meal, She started asking about my routine, if I sometimes misplaced things, if I found the house overwhelming. I answered with clarity, detail, and poise. Still, she smiled that too sweet smile and said, "You're very organized, but sometimes we don't realize how much we're compensating for what's slipping." Translation: You're too competent to be competent. They were building a narrative and ecosystem of control made of paperwork, professionals, and polite concern. It was like being slowly buried in cotton, smothered but gently. Then came the contractors. Malcolm started arriving unannounced with handymen to inspect safety risks. A slightly loose stair rail, emergency. A faucet dripping once overnight, danger. A light flickering in the basement, code violation. He even brought a man named Luis Daniels, someone I'd never met, to declare my front steps structurally unsafe. $3,100 for immediate replacement, he said. I had walked those steps in heels and house slippers through rain and snow for 33 years without incident. But Malcolm insisted, "Don't argue, Mom, it's for your safety." I paid the invoice. Because I was buying time. Every invoice I paid, every suggestion I nodded through it was all part of the delay tactic. I needed the house sold, the new property purchased, the estate documents revised, and I needed them done without interference. It didn't stop there. Malcolm brought in Linda Abrams, a social worker, to perform an environmental assessment. She checked my pantry, hallway, bathtub, and even asked if I had emergency grab bars. She recommended a semi-supported living arrangement with family presence. Translation: the attic. Then came Patricia Ross, a legal advisor Malcolm referred to as a family friend. She tried to slide a durable power of attorney across my kitchen table, already filled out. No conversation, just signature lines. I declined, politely, every time. I signed nothing, because I understood. This wasn't about concern, this was about control. They were writing my story while I was still very much the author. And while all this was unfolding, I was working, not surviving working. Every morning, I reviewed balance sheets. Every afternoon, I called tenants. Every evening, I researched new opportunities. I attended real estate meetups under an alias. I wore blazers with my reading glasses perched on my nose and asked the hard questions, and I listened. To people 20 years younger than me who still didn't know what to do with their first $10,000. I gave them advice, quietly, firmly, and then returned home, smiled at the twins, served Sunday roast, and kept my empire tucked away behind a warm expression and a grandmother's laugh. They never saw it coming, because they never believed I was capable of building something they couldn't control. But the truth is, I was building freedom, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, and I wasn't doing it to prove anything to them. I was doing it because somewhere along the way I realized I didn't want to be remembered as someone who faded. I wanted to be remembered as someone who flew. And the wings I was building weren't for decoration. They were for departure, not from life, but from limits. The morning the moving trucks pulled up was brisk and cloudless, a sky so clear it looked scrubbed clean. I had just finished my coffee in the same kitchen where I used to make pancakes for Malcolm every Saturday morning. But there was no nostalgia today, only focus. The team from Whitmore Relocation arrived right on time, white-gloved professionals, custom crates, climate-controlled trucks. They moved with the precision of surgeons and the care of museum handlers, wrapping my antiques, securing my art, inventorying every item. This was not some desperate escape. This was a coronation. I stood by the bay window, arms folded, watching them load pieces of my life with a grace that whispered, "You did it." I had already made arrangements for the Annapolis house weeks ago. The furniture was in place, the art had been installed, the books were shelved, the kitchen stocked, and the guest rooms prepared for future brunches and laughter, not visits disguised as surveillance. At exactly 11:08 a.m., Malcolm's black SUV screeched into the driveway. He stepped out fast, confusion sharp in his eyes. Sierra followed, clutching her phone, and the twins stayed in the back seat, faces pressed to the window. "Mom," he called, striding toward me. "What is all this?" I didn't move from the front steps. "I'm moving, Malcolm. I told you." He blinked hard, like I'd said something obscene. "To Maryland? To that waterfront house with this production?" His hand gestured to the moving crew like they were aliens. "This is excessive. These movers charge a fortune." I nodded. "Yes, and I can afford it." Sierra had joined him by then, eyes darting from crate to crate. "Eve, this seems extreme. Where is all this money coming from?" I didn't answer with words. I simply handed them the manila folder Tobias had couriered to me that morning, my updated financial portfolio, 13 pages thick. They opened it together on the porch bench, flipping through line after line. Property addresses, purchase dates, renovation budgets, monthly cash flows, net values, return percentages. Each page peeled back another layer of the version of me they thought they knew. Malcolm's face drained a color. Sierra clutched the packet like it might explode. When they reached the final page, net worth $9.1 million. Malcolm looked up slowly. "You're worth over $9 million?" he said, as if saying the number aloud would make it real. "And you make $24,000 a month in passive income?" Sierra asked, voice cracking. I nodded. "Correct." They were silent. Not from disbelief, but from something heavier, realization. That everything they thought they understood was wrong. "But you never told us," Malcolm finally said. "You never asked," I replied. He stared at the papers again, brow furrowed. "You've been investing? For how long?" "Since your father passed," I said. "I took the insurance, the pension, the house title. I learned, I invested, I built something that mattered." Sierra's voice was barely above a whisper. "But why wouldn't you say something? We're family," I smiled. "Because I knew you would try to control it, and you proved me right." She flinched. "That's not fair." I stepped closer. "What's not fair is being offered an attic in a house I helped you buy. What's not fair is being watched, whispered about, evaluated under false pretenses. What's not fair is hearing my own grandchildren ask if I'm still feeling confused because you planted that doubt in their heads." Malcolm stood abruptly, papers in hand. "You didn't have to blindside us. We were trying to help." I shook my head slowly. "No, you were trying to manage. There's a difference. You never asked what I wanted. You just assumed I couldn't be trusted with my own life." I raised my chin. "I'm not mad, but I am clear. I will not be your project. I will not be your concern wrapped in a cardigan. I will not be tucked away like old furniture." Sierra opened her mouth to speak, but I raised a hand. "Let me finish. I love you both, deeply. But this need to save someone who didn't ask to be saved, it ends today." They stood there, stunned, watching me as if I'd grown wings. "I'm moving out," I said. "Not because I have to, but because I want to. I want to live surrounded by peace, not pity. I wants to sip wine on a wraparound porch without someone checking if I've remembered to take my pills." Malcolm looked down, finally, the weight of it all pressing into him. "And when you visit, if you visit," I added, "you will come as guests, not guardians." They left not long after. Not with angry words or slamming doors, just silence. A silence that carried the weight of every assumption they'd ever made, shattered in one morning. As their SUV disappeared down the street, I looked up at Samuel's photo in the living room window. "We did it," I whispered. The drive to Annapolis was serene. The Whitmore lead car guided the caravan like a presidential motorcade. I sat in the back seat of a climate-controlled SUV, jazz playing low, leather seats cradling me. I didn't look back once. Chesapeake Landing Estates welcomed me with wide streets, blooming crepe myrtles, and neighbors who waved without suspicion. The house, my house, sat just off the bay, a colonial beauty with 2 stories, a dock, a guest house, and a kitchen worthy of its own show. The decorators had finished just hours before I arrived. My reading chair sat angled toward the fireplace, my rosewood writing desk faced the sunrise, and the throw blanket Samuel had brought back from Ghana lay folded by the foot of my bed. That night, I lit a lavender candle, poured a glass of red wine, and cooked garlic shrimp barefoot while Jazz danced around the marble counters. There were no creaky stairs, no check-ins, no questions, only quiet. The kind of quiet that feels earned, the kind of quiet that sings. And the next morning, when I stepped onto my private dock with a notebook and a pen, I wrote 2 simple words at the top of the page. I'm home. Life in Annapolis unfolded like a symphony composed just for me. Each morning began with sunlight pouring through the tall windows of my bedroom, casting warm golden light across the quilt Samuel's mother had hand-stitched decades ago. I no longer woke to the subtle pressure of proving I was still okay. There were no hushed check-ins disguised as casual phone calls, no surprise visits with well-meaning contractors or therapists. Instead, I woke to the steady rhythm of peace. My days had purpose, but not the kind dictated by anyone else. I hosted Sunday brunches, not for show, but as a celebration of reinvention. Women began coming from all across the Bay Area. Some retired teachers, others widowed nurses, a former Army captain named Celeste, who had served for 31 years and was now learning how to trade ETFs. They arrived in sundresses, carrying homemade pies and shy hope in their eyes. We drank mimosas, shared laughter, swapped stock tips, and for the first time in a long while, many of them felt seen, heard, relevant. We called it the Legacy Circle, not a club, a movement. I started to small a newsletter with real estate advice for women over 50, then a podcast, then came invitations to speak at wealth summits and financial empowerment conferences. I'd walk onto the stage not with slides or buzzwords, but with stories. Stories of how I turned grief into grit, of how I flipped my first duplex while still healing from Samuel's passing, of how I used silence not as surrender, but as strategy. People listened, not because I was flashy, but because I was real. Authenticity has a sound, and I spoke it fluently. Soon, producers from the Generational Wealth Hour reached out again. They had invited me before, back when I was still pretending for Malcolm's sake. This time, I said yes. They flew to Annapolis, set up cameras in my home, and filmed me on my dock with the bay sparkling behind me. The segment was called Rising After 70, the Woman They Underestimated. When it aired, it became the most shared episode in the show's 5-year history. Comments flooded in from women across the world, grandmothers, divorced mothers, widows, women who had been sidelined, overlooked, or spoken to in that careful voice as if their time had passed. But they wrote to me saying, "I saw you and I remembered myself." The attention didn't inflate me. It sharpened me. I used it. I launched the Langston Legacy Fund, a micro-grant foundation supporting Black women over 55 who wanted to launch late-career ventures, catering businesses, Etsy shops, mobile notary services, bookkeeping, virtual assistant firms. I gave them not just money, but mentorship. I taught them how to buy undervalued properties, how to calculate ROI, how to avoid predatory lenders. I brought in speakers, experts, women who'd done it, and slowly we created something radical, a community where no one was called adorable for daring to dream past retirement. But even as my world expanded, a quiet thread tugged at the back of my heart. Malcolm, not out of guilt, but out of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, seeing the woman behind the mother would shift something in him. I didn't reach out. I let the silence breathe. And then, one February afternoon, it arrived a letter. Not a text, not an email. A real letter with my name written in Malcolm's careful script, just like the ones he used to write me from camp. I sat in my reading chair, candle lit, and opened it with steady hands. "Mom," it began, "I watched the show. I read the article. I listened to the podcast. And the truth is, I didn't recognize the woman they were talking about, because I never took the time to. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was stepping up, but all I was doing was stepping in. I let my fear become control. I assumed that your silence meant surrender, not strategy, that your age meant fragility, not freedom. And for that, I am sorry, not just for what I did, but for what I failed to see. I hope one day you'll forgive me. Love, Malcolm." It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that was enough. A week later, they called. This time not to suggest or arrange, just to ask. Could they visit? I said yes. They arrived on a sunny Saturday morning. Malcolm holding a framed photo of Samuel and me on our 30th anniversary, digitally restored, enlarged, and framed in walnut. Sierra brought flowers. We sat on the back porch. There were awkward silences, but there was also laughter. Sierra asked questions, not the kind that fish for answers, but the kind that hold space. Malcolm listened, really listened. When he said, "I don't want your money. I just want to know the woman behind it all if you'll let me." I nodded. "Now you're finally asking the right question." I told them about my first property, about sitting in freezing rooms waiting for inspections, about nearly missing out on a refinance because I didn't have a co-signer, about crying in the kitchen because the loneliness after Samuel's death felt unbearable, and about the decision to live out loud, even if I had to do it in silence. They didn't interrupt. They absorbed. And for the first time, they didn't see me as a fragile branch. They saw the root, the trunk, the full tree. That evening, as they left, Jordan turned to me and said, "Grandma, you're kind of famous now." I chuckled. "Only to the people who forgot that aging is not a vanishing act." I stood at the dock, watching their taillights fade into the curve of the street. My heart wasn't just full, it was light. Not because everything had been fixed, but because I no longer needed it to be. I had found peace not in being understood, but in understanding myself. The weeks that followed unfolded in quiet triumph. There was no fanfare, no breaking news, just a slow and steady expansion of everything I had fought for. My home in Annapolis became more than a residence, it became a haven, not just for me, but for the women who came seeking something they couldn't always name. They arrived in ones and twos at first, often cautious, often doubting, carrying stories like heavy luggage. Some had been caregivers for so long they forgot they could build anything for themselves. Others had once owned businesses, but lost everything in a divorce, a betrayal, or a downturn. And some had never been given the space to dream at all. But around my long oak table on Sunday mornings, dreams didn't feel frivolous. They felt like blueprints. I told them the same thing I once whispered to myself. You are not done. You are not broken. You are just beginning. The Langston Legacy Fund grew faster than I expected. Within 6 months, we'd issued grants to over 30 women, funded 3 new catering businesses, 2 e-commerce boutiques, a small print-on-demand poetry press, and 1 mobile hair salon owned by a woman who had once cleaned office floors at midnight. We didn't just give money, we gave dignity, options, a reason to open the door every morning with hope. I created a board of advisors made up entirely of women over 60 financial experts, life coaches, real estate mentors, and retired executives who now found themselves more energized than ever. We began hosting quarterly Reclaim dinners, formal events where our grantees shared what they'd built. One evening, a woman named Denise stood up in a thrifted gown and said, I used to think I had nothing left to offer. Now I run a business that employs 3 women and sponsors girls' coding classes. I got my fire back. The room stood still for a moment. Then we erupted in applause, the kind that lifts the soul. Meanwhile, my own empire kept growing quietly. I acquired 2 new properties, 1 multi-unit building in Jersey City and a single-family flip in Prince George's County that had enormous potential. My portfolio hit $10.3 million before spring. Tobias sent over new summaries with celebratory emojis, which still made me laugh. I continued to mentor a small circle of young women in real estate, most of whom had never imagined an older black woman as their financial role model. We spoke weekly, going over cap rates, tax strategies, and how to negotiate with contractors who didn't take them seriously. One of them, Tamika, called me the Queen of Quiet Power. I liked that. And then came the day I opened an email from the Wall Street Journal. The subject line read simply, Feature Request Evelyn Langston. My story had rippled beyond what I ever intended. They wanted to write a long-form profile. I almost said no. But something inside me said, don't hide now. Not after everything. So I agreed. The piece was published under the headline, She Was Offered an Attic. She Built an Empire. It detailed everything: my late start, the first property, the battle to be taken seriously, the betrayal of assumptions, and the final triumph. But the part that resonated most, at least from the messages I received, was this quote, My son tried to put me in the attic. I built a waterfront life instead. The world thought I needed supervision. What I needed was space. The article went viral, but more importantly, it gave voice to a silent revolution happening in households around the world. I began hearing from women in their 60s, 70s, even 80s. Some said they were dusting off business plans. Others said they were finally taking control of their pensions, their health, their time. One message, from a woman named Janice in Minnesota, simply said, I'm turning 72 next week. I just enrolled in a real estate licensing course. I thought you should know I finally believe it's not too late. Malcolm and I began rebuilding not as mother and child bound by duty, but as adults bound by mutual respect. He still visited, but no longer with questions disguised as concern. He came to learn. He asked about ROI and cap rates and listened with humility. One afternoon, after walking with me by the dock, he said quietly, "I always thought protecting you meant shrinking your world to something manageable. I never imagined you were outgrowing everything we knew." I smiled, watching the ripples on the water. "That's because you were looking backward, not forward." The twins, Jordan and Caleb, started asking me for advice. Not about cookies or curfews, but about investing. Jordan told me he was thinking of saving up for a property. Caleb started shadowing me during virtual property walkthroughs. "You're like a real-life boss grandma," he said one night. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my tea. "No," I said, "I'm just finally showing up as myself." On the anniversary of Samuel's death, I held a quiet dinner at my home. Just close friends. We lit candles, played his favorite Miles Davis record, and I read a letter I'd written to him. I won't share all of it, but it ended with these words. "I didn't shrink. I expanded. I didn't fade. I rose, and I carried you in every brick, every bid, every moment. I refused to be less than whole. You were the beginning of this, Samuel, but I chose the rest." One morning in late summer, as I walked to the dock with my journal, I noticed a young woman sitting on the edge, feet dangling over the water. She looked nervous, lost. I walked over and sat beside her. "This is your home?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "it is." She looked at the house. "It's beautiful." Then she turned to me. "How did you get here?" I didn't give her a speech. I just smiled and said, "One decision at a time," starting with the one that said I didn't have to wait to be chosen. I could choose myself. She nodded slowly. I handed her a card, the Langston Legacy Fund, and said, "You don't need permission to rewrite your story. You just need a pen." She took it with both hands like it was a lifeline. Maybe it was. So now you've heard it. The whole story. A woman offered an attic who chose the horizon. A mother mistaken for fragile who turned silence into an asset portfolio. And most of all, a reminder. You are not too old. You are not too late. You are not too quiet. You are simply waiting to remember your own name. And when you do, oh, what a story you'll write. If this moved you, remember her name, Evelyn Langston. And maybe one day someone will remember yours too, not for how you aged, but for how you rose.